A rope doesn't kill you right away. First, it convinces you that you can still bargain with air. Elijah Thorne sat on an old nag, and the noose hung around his neck so matter-of-factly. It could have been a strap from a satchel. The sun stood high and burned the color out of the world. The dust wasn't yellow, it was pale, like ash. The stones looked like bones. The sparse shrubs, like the land's dried veins. Above them, vultures were already circling, not because they believed in luck, but because they knew the habit of this country. Everything here ends the same way. 5 riders surrounded him in a half-circle, faces covered with bandanas, hands in gloves, the kind worn by people who don't want to leave fingerprints, even on their own conscience. The leader kept a little apart. St. Cyrus. He had a gold tooth and a small Bible in his saddlebag, an item he carried not for faith, but so he could take it out sometimes and show that he had the right to be cruel. Elijah didn't beg for mercy. He knew begging sounded like laughter out here. He kept his eyes open and watched their horses, their straps, their buckles, every detail that could become a chance. His hands were tied behind his back, but not tight. He'd tensed his muscles beforehand so his wrists would keep a little room. An old trick for old man. Old man Jai. Stubborn. St. Cyrus said something like a question, but Elijah barely listened to the words. He listened to something else. The buzz of a fly landing on a horse's rump, the creak of leather on a saddle, the click of a cocked hammer, unnecessary, but habitual. And among those sounds he caught the most important one. Cyrus's short inhale. It was the inhale of a man about to do a job quickly and calmly. Elijah said the only thing that could delay death by 1 second, that he'd swallowed the key to the bank vault. Not truth bait. He saw greed tighten Cyrus's throat for the briefest moment. That fraction of a second is exactly what people still alive know how to bet on. Cyrus didn't believe him, but he doubted. And doubt in the desert is a crack in a wall. The bandit on the left rode in too, loosened the noose. Too close. Too lazy. Elijah kicked his legs forward and struck the horse in the chest with his boots. The animal squealed, jerked, and slammed into the neighboring mountain that won into Cyrus's horse. The dust swallowed everything. Hooves, curses, tearing reins. The noose slipped off Elijah's neck. He hit the ground, rolled, and his fingers found something that seemed impossible to keep in that position. A tiny derringer hidden in his sleeve. 2 rounds, 2 short punches of fate. The first shot shattered the nearest bandits. Not to kill him, but to take his walking away. The second hit Cyrus in the shoulder, knocking the revolver out of his hand. Not heroics arithmetic. Elijah sprang up, snatched a fallen colt, and ran for the ravine, while the bandits struggled to settle their horses. He ran as if heat itself were chasing him. Sand burned his soles, even through leather. His mouth tasted of blood. His chest held a hollow space, with no victory and no joy, because he knew he hadn't swallowed any key, and because he knew something else. If Cyrus survived, he wouldn't let it go. This wouldn't be about money anymore. It would be about humiliation, about Elijah daring to slip the noose and leave the boss alive, but made a fool. Elijah lay hidden in dry grass at the bottom of the ravine as the sun sank, painting the rocks rusty. He listened to the silence and understood that silence isn't the absence of sound. Silence is waiting. Somewhere up there, Cyrus had surely stopped raging and started thinking, and the thoughts of a man like that are more dangerous than any revolver. Elijah checked the cylinder of the stolen Colt. 4 rounds. He also had a knife taken from the belt of the man whose knee he'd destroyed. The handle was dull and smelled of sweat and cheap leather. Elijah didn't like other people's things, but right now he liked living more than he liked being clean about it. He moved at night when stones stopped burning and start cutting with cold. His path led to the mine folks called the Devil's Tear. Rumors said Cyrus kept his den there, and rumors said they were holding a boy there. Toby, a 12-year-old mute, taken from his home because his father once hid Confederate gold. 2 days earlier before that, Nusi Elijah had been sitting in the rusty Horseshoe Saloon, trying to drown his past in whiskey. He'd been doing it for months. Sometimes the past sank for an hour. Sometimes it bobbed right back up like a cork. A woman approached him with eyes where desperation wasn't an emotion, but a condition of the skin. She set a pouch of gold on the table, heavy and dull, like someone else's sin. Elijah wanted to shove it away. He wanted to say no. But the words about a mute boy hit harder than any sum. He took the money, not because he'd grown he took it because once he'd already been to late his daughter died of fever while he was chasing bandits in another state. And that too late became a separate organ inside him, aching quieter than the heart and longer. Now that organ drove him forward. By dawn he saw the mine, a black mouth in the rock, a couple half-collapsed shacks, the traces of a fire. 2 sentries sipped coffee lazily, like they were guarding a flour warehouse, not a nest of killers. Elijah understood. These men weren't afraid of an attack, meaning they weren't used to being attacked. He moved over the stone so it wouldn't crunch, tossed a rock into the brush. 1 sentry stood and went to check. Elijah stepped to the other and did what books call cruelty and the West calls speed. A knife under the ribs, a hand over the mouth. 1 short jerkined the body, became a heavy rag. The 1st sentry returned before he could invent words. The bullet went between his eyes. The crack tore the morning, echoed down the canyon. Stealth was over. The hunt began. Elijah crashed into the shacks. Sleepy faces, confusion, curses, hands reaching for guns. 3 shots, 3. Bodies dropping. In the cramped room, gun smoke was a fog made of iron. He burst back outside and, in that moment, heard Cyrus's voice somewhere deeper, as if the mine itself were speaking through his mouth. Elijah dove into the drift. Inside it smelled of damp, rotting wood, an old fear. The tunnels branched like someone else's thoughts. He went where fresh torch marks stained the walls. With every step the air grew colder, like the mine wasn't simply going down, but going back into the past. At one point, a bullet struck rock beside his ear, showering his face with grit. Elijah fell behind a mine cart, his heart pounding as if it wanted to rip itself free and run on its own. In a widened cavern, he saw Cyrus, and he saw the boy. Toby stood beside him, held by the collar like a sack of grain. A barrel was pressed to the boy's temple. Toby's eyes were wide, but there was no hysteria in them. No, child's help me. There was something else, something adult, something calm. Elijah realized that was the real strangeness in all this. Not the bandits, not the mean, not the gold. A 12-year-old who looked at death like he'd already met it personally. Elijah lowered his gun. He wasn't playing hero. He was calculating odds. Shush! Shuchi! Cyrus used the boy as cover. Any mistake wouldn't be about Elijah. It would be about Toby. And then Elisha noticed the details around them. A rotten support beam. A crate of dynamite, darkened with age and speckled with greasy drops, as if it were sweating. In mines, men fear dynamite like that more than bullets. It lives its own life and explodes because someone was stupid. Elijah did what a man does when he has nothing left to lose. He didn't try to beat Cyrus. He tried to beat the space. He tore the buckle off a strap and hurled it at the lantern above the crate. Glass burst, oil spilled. Flame kissed the dynamite. The next second became an eternity. Cyrus barely managed to shove the boy away and bolt for the exit. Elijah threw himself to the ground. The explosion wasn't Elaujichi, was Mafal Gaddib. Like a mountain's growl, the tunnel lurched. The ceiling began to cave. Rocks fell like fate with no explanation. Dust filled Elijah's lungs. His tongue stuck to his palate. He coughed as if he were coughing his lungs out of his body. When the dust thinned a little, Cyrus was gone. Where he'd stood was now a heap of stone. but the exit was blocked. And that was worse than Cyrus alive, because now the mine had become their grave. Water started rising from below. The blast had ruptured underground seams. It came quietly, without threat, like inevitability. Elijah found Toby off to the side. The boy was coated in dust, his face scratched, but he was alive. He didn't cry. He watched, assessed, the way an adult assesses a root and then pointed deeper into the tunnel, toward a faint draft, a ventilation shaft, a chance no bigger than a swallow. They climbed up on rusted, rotting rungs. Elijah pushed Toby ahead of him because the boy was lighter. Every meter was pain in shoulders, in old wounds, in fingers. Below, water climbed. It was icy, yet it felt hot from fear. Elijah didn't look down. He understood if he looked down, something inside him would quit. At last, they squeezed out through a narrow crack in the rocks. The night was clear. Stars shone so brightly they looked like coins you could scoop up by hand. The wind was cold and smelled of freedom. Elijah collapsed into the sand and, for the first time in a long time, felt not victory, but relief's just the fact of breathing. And then the tension returned, because Toby pulled a small object from his pocket metal, gleaming familiar. A key, the very key every rumor had been about. Not a symbol, not a legend, a real key. Elijah understood the boy couldn't have accidentally had it. A mute child, supposedly held for. Information was carrying the information on his body that shattered the simple picture. And in Toby's eyes, Elijah saw the same thing he'd seen in the mine. Calm, adult resolve. And he understood something frightening. Toby wasn't just a victim. He was part of the mechanism. While the gang hunted Elijah, the boy already knew where they were going to lead themselves. The mine, the dynamite, the supports, the ventilation route. It all looked less like chance and more like preparation, like someone had built a labyrinth in advance and simply waited for the right people to step inside. Elijah hated thoughts like that because they made him not a rescuer but a pawn. They crossed the night desert in silence. Sometimes Toby stopped and pointed the way. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd walked this route 100 times. Elijah followed. His knees trembled with fatigue, but his mind stayed cold, trying to assemble a new picture. At dawn, they reached a shallow depression between rocks, screened by brush. There was a cache there, not a random hole, but a carefully made niche reinforced with planks. Inside lay sacks, not one or too many. When Elijah tore one open, he saw the shine. Gold. Gold that cost lives. Gold people killed for, vanished for, sold themselves for. And in that moment, Elijah felt what he'd tried to drown in whiskey rise again. Anger. Not at Cyrus. Not at bandits. At the very idea that there was metal in the world more important than a child's breath. Toby stood beside him and looked at the gold without awe. Not like a child seeing wealth for the first time, like a man looking at a tool. Elijah understood. Toby's father hadn't hidden the gold for nothing. He hid its end, disappeared. And the boy was likely the only remaining key to the place. The gang took him not because he knew something, but because they had no other path left. But why had the boy led them here so calmly? The answer came painfully simple. Toby didn't want the gold returned. He wanted the story closed. He wanted the ones who came for the gold not to go back. He wanted Ash Canyon to take what it was owed. The meanie head and tea been an escape. The mine had been a trap. Elijah remembered that. Look, the moment the dynamite caught it, Toby hadn't been afraid. He'd been waiting. That realization hit harder than a bullet because it made the boy not saved, but dangerous. Elijah felt he no longer understood whom he'd saved damned. That saving itself could be a crime if what you saved carried cold inside it. They returned to town 2 days later. Toby's mother threw herself at him as if an embrace could patch every hole in the world. She cried so hard people nearby felt ashamed and looked away. Elijah stood a little apart and said nothing. Someone tried to press money into his hand. He didn't take it. The town celebrated a victory because Cyrus was gone. The gang scattered, and it seemed that danger had left. But Elisha knew danger doesn't leave. It changes shape. He noticed how Toby watched the street quietly, carefully like an adult measuring future problems. There was no childhood in that look. The night before, by the gold, Elijah had noticed a thin scar on the boy's neck, less like a rope mark and more like a chain. It was older than the kidnapping, which meant Toby had been a captive before. Not of the gang, of something else. Maybe of his father. Maybe of the gold itself. Elijah left town at morning, before the dust had time to rise. He wasn't riding into the sunset for a pretty picture. He rode because he understood if he stayed, they'd either make him a hero or make him a witness, and witnesses don't live long. The West loves only two things: legend and silence. On the road, he stopped by a creek and washed the blood from his hands. The water was cold, and a strange tremor ran through him, not from the chill, but from the thought that this was only the beginning, because the gold hadn't gone anywhere. He knew where it lay, and he knew Toby knew it too. If the boy grew up near that cache, if he used people to destroy a gang, then he would use people again. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. That's how the most terrifying people are made. Not from love of evil, but from the habit of solving problems permanently. Elijah understood he hadn't saved a child. He'd saved the future of someone who could watch an explosion calmly. And that was more frightening than St. Cyrus with a gold tooth and a Bible in his bag. Because Cyrus was simple evil. You could kill him with a stone. But Toby was a silence that grows. And as Elijah rode farther on, somewhere behind him, Ash Canyon remained where it was. Gray, dry, patient. The kind that doesn't forget. The kind that waits for someone to come for the gold again. And then, very possibly, Elijah would hear again somewhere. In the heat, the creak of saddle. Leather, and understand that a noose isn't always a rope around your neck. Sometimes a noose is a promise you made yourself in a moment of weakness, and it pulls you back.